A man who stopped believing in people. A woman who had nowhere left to go. One brutal blizzard that gave them no choice but to trust each other, or die. When Coulter Hayes placed that mail-order bride advertisement in the newspaper, he wasn't looking for love. He was looking for survival. What he got was Evelyn Hart, a quiet woman with haunted eyes, a busted ankle, and a rifle she wasn't afraid to use. What happened next in that frozen Wyoming valley would change both of them forever. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't regret it. The train was 40 minutes late. Coulter Hayes knew this because he'd been standing on the same frozen platform since 2:30, and the cold had worked its way through his wool coat somewhere around the third hour. His boots, good boots, resoled twice, were packed with snow from the walk across the depot yard, and no amount of stomping seemed to shake the numbness out of his toes anymore. Iron Ridge Depot wasn't much of a depot. It was a single-room building with a wood stove that the station master kept burning hot enough to blister paint, 2 benches worn smooth by years of travelers who never stayed, and a hand-lettered sign above the door that read Iron Ridge, Pop, 214. Someone had scratched a question mark after the number in pencil. Coulter had never found out who did it or when, but he suspected the count was optimistic either way. He stood outside rather than in. Inside meant Mr. Aldous Pemberton, the station master, who had a talent for conversation that Coulter had neither the patience nor the warmth for on a day like this. Aldous would ask about the ranch. Then he'd ask about the cattle losses from last winter. Then he'd get around to asking, sideways the way people in small towns always did, why exactly Coulter Hayes, 34 years old, owner of the only cattle operation north of the Bitterroot Range still turning anything resembling a profit, had placed a bride advertisement in the Denver Territorial Gazette. Coulter didn't have a clean answer for that question, not one he was willing to say out loud anyway. So he stood in the cold, watching the tracks. The advertisement had been Frank Doyle's idea. Frank was his nearest neighbor, a half-day's ride south. And Frank had the kind of cheerful stupidity that made Coulter simultaneously irritated and grateful to have around. Frank's wife, May, had brought it up first, actually, sitting at their kitchen table in October with a bowl of stew in front of him, Frank's 3 kids crawling over each other in the next room, the smell of burning pine thick in the air. You need somebody up there, Coulter, May had said, not looking up from her mending. That cabin wasn't built for one person. It wasn't built for one person to survive in anyway. He'd argued. He always argued. But May Doyle had a way of being right that was almost violent in its precision. So in November, he'd written the advertisement. It took him 4 tries to get it down to something that didn't sound either desperate or dishonest. And even then, he wasn't satisfied. He'd described the ranch as working cattle operation, 340 acres, good water, solid structures, which was true. He'd described himself as capable, experienced frontierman, widower, non-drinker, which was also true. He'd left out the part about how the cabin had a gap in the north wall that turned into a wind tunnel when the temperature dropped below 0. He'd left out the 3 consecutive winters that had each taken something from him he hadn't gotten back. 12 women had written. He'd answered 11 of them. Evelyn Hart had been the 12th letter, arriving late and water-damaged at one corner, written in a handwriting that was precise without being pretty. She hadn't described herself the way the others had, hadn't cataloged her domestic skills or her church attendance or her general pleasantness of disposition. She'd written, I'm not afraid of cold weather or hard work. I don't expect comfort. I expect honesty. If those 2 things are on offer, I can manage everything else. That was it. That was the whole letter, near enough. Coulter had read it twice, then put it down on the kitchen table and gone outside to check on the horses for no particular reason. When he came back in, he read it a 3rd time. Then he wrote back. Now here he was, and the train was 40 minutes late, and somewhere in his chest there was a tension he couldn't quite name, part dread, part something else he wasn't examining too closely. The whistle came first, low and distant, rolling across the frozen valley like something dragged through cotton. Then the headlamp appeared around the curve of the ridge, a single yellow eye cutting through the gray afternoon, and Coulter straightened up off the post he'd been leaning against and tried to look like a man who was perfectly at ease with all of this. He was not. The train ground to a stop with the kind of mechanical complaint that suggested it, too, was unhappy about the weather. Steam erupted from beneath the cars in great rolling clouds. The station master came out of the depot to receive the mail pouch, nodding at Coulter with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and entertained at the same time. 3 passengers got off. The first was a heavy-set man in a traveling coat who moved like he had somewhere important to be and was already annoyed that he hadn't arrived yet. He disappeared into the depot without looking up. The second was an older woman with a hat pinned at a slightly chaotic angle, carrying a basket and talking to herself in what sounded like German. She spotted a man waiting further down the platform and made her way toward him with evident relief. The third passenger stood at the top of the steps for a moment, and Coulter looked at her, and she looked at him, and the steam from the train drifted between them. She was younger than he'd expected. Not by a lot, maybe late 20s, but he'd built a picture in his mind during those weeks of correspondence, and the picture had been vague and older and safer, feeling somehow than what he was looking at right now. She was narrow through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that had seen better years, and she carried a single suitcase that was held shut by a leather strap because the clasp had clearly broken at some point and been never replaced. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a way that had started neat and ended the train journey in partial disarray, strands escaping at her temples. Her eyes found him and didn't look away. Brown eyes, he'd learn later, though in that first moment with the winter light flat and pale, they looked almost black. There was something in them he recognized without being able to name, the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding themselves together through an effort of pure will for long enough that it had become invisible to them. He knew that particular look because he saw it in his own mirror most mornings. She came down the steps carefully. The bottom step was iced, and she hesitated, and he almost moved forward to offer his hand, but she'd already managed it herself, gripping the rail and stepping down with the deliberate precision of someone who refused to fall. They stood 4 feet apart on the platform. Iron Ridge pressed around them. 2 streets, a saloon, a general store, 12 buildings, and the depot, and a church with a missing window stuffed with a flour sack, and beyond it all, the mountains, white and enormous and absolute. "Miss Hart," Coulter said. It came out lower than he'd intended, rougher at the edges. He cleared his throat. "I'm Coulter Hayes." "I know," she said. "You look like your letter." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not quite searching, not quite wary. Something in between. "The train was delayed," she said. 40 minutes. 43. She shifted the suitcase to her other hand. There was ice on the tracks outside of Heron Pass. "We sat for almost an hour while they cleared it." "Did you eat?" "On the train, there was a woman selling sandwiches out of a basket." A beat. "They weren't very good. I can get you something before we ride out if you want." "The general store." "I'm fine." She said it quickly, without weight. Not cold, exactly. Just efficient. Like she'd learned that accepting small comforts was a way of slowing down, and slowing down was something she couldn't afford. "How long is the ride to the ranch?" 2.5 hours in good weather." He looked up at the sky, which was the color of a dirty iron pot and moving in a way he didn't like. "We should leave soon." She followed his gaze, looked at the sky for a moment. "That doesn't look like good weather coming." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She looked back at him. Something shifted in her face, not fear, more like recalibration, the process of adjusting expectations. "Then let's go." The wagon was nothing to be proud of. It was a working wagon, not a passenger wagon, and Coulter had thrown 2 wool blankets in the back and a piece of canvas over the seat as a concession to the fact that he was collecting a person rather than supplies. He'd been aware of this inadequacy while doing it and had chosen to feel guilty about it quietly rather than do anything more elaborate. Evelyn didn't say anything about the wagon. She climbed up to the seat without assistance, settled the suitcase between her feet, and tucked one of the blankets around her legs in a way that suggested she'd navigated cold temperatures before and had developed opinions about it. He climbed up the other side, spoke to the horses. They moved out of the depot yard and onto the main street of Iron Ridge, and Coulter kept his eyes forward and tried to figure out what exactly the protocol was for this situation. The protocol, as near as he could determine, was silence because neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then she said, "You didn't mention in your letters that the cabin was unfinished." He kept his eyes on the road. "Did May Doyle tell you that?" "May Doyle wrote to me, yes. She wanted to be sure I knew what I was riding into. She seemed..." A pause. Concerned about me coming. May is concerned about everything. It's her way. She said the north wall has a gap in it. Coulter exhaled through his nose. I'm going to fix it before the worst of the winter hits. It's December. I know what month it is. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, there was no accusation in it, just fact. That's an important detail to leave out of correspondence. He couldn't argue with that. I thought if I put it in, you wouldn't come. I almost didn't come anyway. That surprised him enough that he looked at her. She was watching the road ahead, her profile composed, giving nothing away. What made you decide to? He asked. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, I was out of alternatives. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't warm. He appreciated it enormously. That's honest? He said. I told you I'd be honest. She glanced at him sideways. I hope you were too. I tried to be. The gap in the wall. I tried to be mostly honest, he amended. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the general neighborhood of one. Brief, involuntary, quickly contained. He filed it away without knowing why. They were halfway up the mountain road when the sky changed. Coulter felt it before he saw it. A pressure drop, sudden and specific, the kind that settled in his back teeth and behind his eyes. He'd spent enough winters in these mountains to know that feeling. His hands tightened on the reins. Storm's coming faster than I thought, he said. Evelyn was already looking at the sky. The clouds that had been moving slowly overhead had taken on a different character in the last 20 minutes. Lower, darker, moving with an urgency that suggested they had somewhere to be and were not interested in being delayed. The temperature, which had been cold, was becoming something else, something mean. How far to the cabin? She asked. Hour and a half at a walk, maybe an hour if I push the horses. Push the horses. He already was. The first snow came 15 minutes later. Not the polite, gradual kind, but the sudden kind, arriving like a decision. Heavy flakes, driven sideways by a wind that had come up out of nowhere and developed strong opinions about direction. Within 10 minutes, visibility had dropped to the point where the road was more memory than visible fact. Coulter knew this road. He'd driven it in every condition the mountain had offered in 11 years, and he knew every curve and every rock and every place the embankment dropped off to the left. He kept the horses at a careful pace, talking to them low and steady. Not words exactly, just sounds, the kind that settled nervous animals. The gelding on the left, Bruiser, had a tendency to spook in whiteout conditions, and Coulter watched the line of his back for the first signs of tension. Beside him, Evelyn had pulled the canvas over both of them, leaning slightly into his space without asking. A practical decision, not a personal one. She kept her head down against the wind and said nothing. No panic. No complaints. He could feel the tension in her, the careful, controlled quality of her breathing, but she wasn't falling apart, and she wasn't demanding anything from him. He'd half expected her to demand things. A lot of the women in those 12 letters had felt somehow demanding, as if the exchange being proposed gave them standing to have expectations, which he supposed it did. But there was something about Evelyn Hart's particular kind of need that didn't include demands. It included endurance. That was different. The wind screamed across the ridge when they crested it, and Bruiser shied hard to the right, and Coulter had both hands full of reins and leather and bad decision for about 30 seconds before the horse steadied. Snow stung his face. His eyes were watering, and he couldn't tell entirely if it was the cold or the concentration. Are we going to make it? Evelyn asked. Her voice was even. The question was practical. Yes, he said. He wasn't entirely sure, but he said it like he was, and she seemed to decide that was good enough. What? They made it. The cabin appeared through the snow like something half-dreamed, a dark shape gradually assembling itself into walls and a roof and a covered porch. The lamp in the window that Coulter had left burning all day, throwing a rectangle of yellow light into the storm. He told himself he left the lamp on as a navigational aid. He hadn't examined that justification too closely. He pulled the wagon up to the barn first, because the horses needed seeing to before anything else. Before warmth, before rest, before the conversation that was waiting somewhere in the evening ahead of them. He jumped down, already moving. Can you get yourself inside, Sol? He called over the wind. Lamps lit. There's wood by the stove, matches on the shelf above it. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon before he'd finished asking. She grabbed her suitcase. I'll help with the horses first. You don't have... I'll help, she said again, and walked past him toward the barn door. He stood there for a moment in the blowing snow, watching her drag the barn door open with both hands and lean into it against the wind, and felt something complicated and uncharacterized move through him. Then he went to help. The barn was warmer than outside, which wasn't saying much, but it was a relief from the wind at least. It smelled like horses and old hay and the particular dark sweetness of large animals in close quarters. There were 4 stalls, 2 horses, 2 cattle, and the cattle were restless, moving against their stall walls in that low-grade anxiety that animals showed when they sensed bad weather before they fully understood it. Coulter worked the traces off Bruiser while Evelyn managed the buckles on the other side of the second horse. The gray mare he called Tuesday, for no particular reason he'd ever been able to explain. Evelyn's fingers were clearly cold. He could see it in the stiffness of her movements, the slight clumsiness that wasn't her fault. But she didn't stop. She worked methodically through the buckles, muttering something under her breath in a tone that suggested she was not speaking to him and not particularly speaking to the horse, but just releasing thoughts she needed released. You've worked with horses before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. My uncle had 2. She freed the last buckle and stepped back while the mare shifted her weight. Nothing like this country, but horses are horses mostly. Where are you from? She glanced at him across the back of Tuesday. A brief calculation seemed to happen behind her eyes. Missouri originally, then Ohio, then a pause. I've been moving around. He didn't push. He led Bruiser into his stall and started toweling the horse down with the rough cloth he kept hanging on the post. Evelyn was doing the same for Tuesday, handling the animal with a firmness that was respectful rather than rough. Why Wyoming? She asked, eventually. What made you come out this far? Came for the land. Stayed because leaving felt like admitting it beat me. She was quiet for a moment, then, did it? Beat you? The honesty of the question caught him slightly off guard. Some years it gets close, he said. This year was close. Is that why you wrote the advertisement? He spread a blanket over Bruiser and secured it, turned around. She was watching him over Tuesday's back, her coat white with snow, her dark hair wet at the temples, and there was no judgment in her expression, just that same quality of waiting, of taking information in without yet deciding what to do with it. Partly, he said. Partly, it was May Doyle. Partly something else? He looked at her for a moment. The wind was making the barn walls flex and sigh, and somewhere out in the storm, another gust crashed into the mountain and sent snow hissing through every crack in the siding. Partly, he said, I was tired of the quiet. It was more honest than he'd intended to be, on this first evening, with the snow coming down and the distance between them still measured in feet of actual floor space. But she didn't seem alarmed by it. She just nodded, slow and thoughtful, like it was something she understood. Me too, she said. They went inside. The cabin was what it was. A single main room with a stone fireplace and a kitchen corner, a bedroom partitioned off by a hanging wool blanket, a table with 2 chairs that didn't match each other, and the north wall that, yes, he hadn't been wrong to feel some guilt about this, had a gap at the joint between the log sill and the foundation that let in a finger width of winter every time the wind shifted east. He'd chinked it twice. It had refused to hold. He got the stove going while Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and looked around. He watched her from the corner of his eye, braced for what, exactly? Disappointment? Disgust? Some version of the expression that would confirm what he'd half suspected, which was that no letter could accurately prepare a person for this. She turned slowly, looked at the north wall, looked at the gap, looked at the fireplace, which was working well, looked at the kitchen corner with its iron cook stove and the modest collection of shelves above it, looked at the 2 mismatched chairs. It's smaller than I pictured, she said. I know, but it's not bad. She set her suitcase down near the table. The fireplace is good. That matters more than size. Drafts from the north wall. I can see that. She was looking at the gap with what appeared to be genuine practical assessment. Do you have rags? Even stuffing it would help short term. There's a box of rags behind the stove. I've tried. I'll look at it after I change. She said this with the flat confidence of someone who had been solving inadequate shelter problems for long enough to have developed actual opinions about the methodology. Do you have a system for the water barrel? Does it freeze overnight? Not if the stove's going. I bank it before bed. Good. She picked up her suitcase. Which side of the bedroom is mine? He blinked. He had not, in all the weeks of correspondence and anticipation, and standing in the cold at the depot, actually thought through the logistics of the bedroom arrangement with any clarity. He'd been operating on some vague assumption that time would resolve this, and time had now presented itself and was waiting for him to say something intelligent. Right side, he managed. There's a second blanket on the hook. Thank you. She went through the wool curtain. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the storm work itself up outside, and had the bizarre and disorienting sensation of having a person in his house. A specific, present, actual person who took up space and had opinions about rags and wall gaps. The cabin had been empty for a long time, not just of people. He'd had Frank and May here, and occasionally other neighbors, but of the particular weight of someone who was going to stay. It was strange. It was also, and he examined this feeling with some suspicion before he let himself acknowledge it, not unwelcome. She came back out 20 minutes later in different clothes, a dark wool dress, practical, her hair repinned more neatly, carrying the box of rags she'd found behind the stove. She knelt at the north wall without preamble. Coulter watched her for a moment from the table where he'd been attempting to read a month-old newspaper without actually taking in any of the words. You don't have to do that tonight. I'm cold, she said, folding a rag with the efficient motions of someone who had an actual opinion about rag geometry. I'd rather not be cold while we sleep, so yes, I do have to do this tonight. She worked at the gap for a few minutes. He could see her testing the fit, adjusting the folding, pressing the rag firmly into the space. Her movements were precise without being fussy. When she was satisfied, she sat back on her heels and looked at it. That'll hold until morning, she said. In the morning, you show me where the chinking materials are, and we'll do it properly. You've done chinking. I've done most things badly at least once. She stood up, dusted her hands on her skirt. Supper? They ate what he had, salt pork, hardtack, dried beans he'd soaked the night before and cooked through the day. It wasn't elegant. He'd been vaguely aware that it wasn't elegant while he was making it, and had possessed neither the skills nor the motivation to make it otherwise. She ate without complaint. The hardtack she softened in the bean liquid, a trick he'd learned himself in his first bad winter, and which she deployed with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who'd known it longer. The beans are good, she said. They're just beans. I've had a lot of beans that weren't. She looked up at him across the table. What do you usually eat? On a regular day? Whatever's easy. I don't spend a lot of time on food. I can see that. She said it without judgment, observationally. I'm a decent cook, not fancy, but decent. You don't owe me anything on that front. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, a small surprise, quickly processed, like she'd been expecting a different kind of man and had just received a data point suggesting otherwise. I know I don't, she said carefully. I'm telling you because it's useful information, same as you telling me about the water barrel. Fair enough. They ate in silence for a moment. The wind hammered the cabin. The lamp swung slightly on its hook. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the cattle in the barn were making that low, uneasy sound. How many head? She asked. 12 right now. Lost 3 last winter. Had 5 calves in spring, sold 2. And it's enough? To keep the ranch running? He was quiet for a moment. It's enough to keep surviving. He looked at her steadily. I told you I'd be mostly honest. You did. She met his look. And the mostly honest version? 3 more winters like last year and there's nothing left to keep. She nodded. She seemed to be turning this over, not panicking, not regretting, just weighing it with the same practical seriousness she'd brought to the wall gap and the rag box. Then we'd better have a better winter, she said. He almost said we. He stopped himself because it seemed too fast, too sudden a thing to say. The way turning a word like we into something real out of a single evening seemed like it required more earning than they'd done so far. But she'd said it. He let it sit there. Later, with the dishes done and the fire banked and the wind still screaming at the mountain outside, he sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and listened to the storm intensify. There was a specific sound this storm was making that he didn't like. A low, sustained moan that wasn't just wind. It was the sound of barometric pressure doing something dramatic and fast. The sound of the kind of storm that settled in and stayed. He'd heard it before. He'd lost a horse to a storm that made that sound back in his second winter here, when he'd been young enough and stupid enough to underestimate what the mountain could do when it decided to. He was not young anymore, and he had learned slowly and at considerable expense the specific language of the weather in this valley. This was not going to be a one-night storm. He thought about the cattle in the barn and what they'd need. He thought about the water barrels and the wood supply. He thought about the gap in the north wall that Evelyn Hart had stuffed with rags and would want to chink properly in the morning, and about the fact that the morning might look like the beginning of several days trapped inside this cabin with a woman he'd known for approximately 4 hours. The curtain over the bedroom shifted. Evelyn stood in the doorway, wrapped in the extra blanket, her hair down now around her shoulders. "You should sleep," she said. "You're going to need it." "I'm listening to the storm." "I know, I've been listening too." She was quiet for a moment. "It's going to be bad." "Yes." "What do we need to do?" He looked at her, standing there in the lamplight with the blanket around her shoulders and her hair loose and her expression the same even, practical thing it had been since she stepped off that train, and had a sharp, specific thought that surprised him with its clarity. She's going to be useful. And then underneath that, quieter and less examined. She's going to be more than that. He pushed the second thought aside. It was too early for it. Everything was too early for everything. "I'll go check the barn before I sleep," he said. "Make sure the livestock have water that won't freeze." "I'll come." "You don't have to. You keep saying that." She looked at him with something that was almost patience, but had an edge to it. "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. Is there a difference I should know about?" He looked at her for a moment. "No," he admitted. "There isn't." "Good." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Give me a moment to put my coat on." Outside, the storm had become something serious. They pushed through it together, shoulder to shoulder, because the visibility demanded it. Because without the contact, without the warmth of her arm against his, the night and the snow would have turned them into two separate disasters instead of one slightly less disastrous unit. The wind was the kind that got under clothing and took the heat from your core in long, methodical pulls. Coulter covered the 20 yards to the barn in what felt like a sustained argument with the weather, and Evelyn kept up with him without slowing, without complaint, head down into the wind and both hands gripping the rope he kept strung between the cabin and the barn for exactly this purpose. For exactly this purpose. He'd strung that rope after the horse, after the second winter. Inside the barn, breathless and snow-covered, they stood for a moment in the relative shelter. The horses were unhappy. The cattle were unhappy. Everybody had opinions about the storm. "Water's still liquid," Coulter said, checking the barrel. "I'll insulate it better." "What do they need?" "What?" "Extra hay, more than they'd normally get." He was already moving. "The cold burns calories. They need to keep their weight up." Evelyn didn't wait to be told what to do with this information. She found the hay store and started pulling sections of it down into the stalls. She did it wrong at first, too much at once, trying to carry what should have been 2 loads in one, and he watched her recalibrate when the bundle shifted and spilled, and she just picked it up and adjusted without making it a thing. There was something genuinely useful about the fact that she didn't make things a thing. "Talk to them," he said, working on the water barrel insulation. "While you're doing that, horses especially. Bruiser's nervous." She looked at the gelding, who was shifting and eyeing the barn walls with deep suspicion. Then she looked at Coulter with an expression that suggested she found this instruction slightly absurd. But she turned back to the horse. "All right," she said, in a tone that was clearly being deployed against her better judgment. "It's okay. It's loud and terrible out there, and you're a horse, and you don't understand meteorology. So," Bruiser actually turned and looked at her. "So we're just going to deal with it together," she continued with slightly less self-consciousness. "You and me and everyone else in this barn." Coulter kept his eyes on what he was doing, but the corner of his mouth moved without his permission. They worked for another 30 minutes. By the time they were satisfied, Hay laid in, water insulated, both horses calm to something approaching acceptance of the situation. The storm outside had deepened into a full roar. The barn doors vibrated in their frames. Snow was forcing itself through the siding in thin white lines, like the mountain was trying to write something. Evelyn stood in the center of the barn with hay in her hair and cold high in her cheeks, and her coat covered in a thin layer of barn dust and snow, and she looked at him with an expression that he couldn't quite categorize, except that it was more open than anything she'd shown him since she stepped off the train. "Will they be okay?" she asked. "About the animals?" "Probably," he said. "This barn's held through worse." He paused. "But I'll check again in the morning, early. I'll come." He didn't say you don't have to. He was learning. "Okay," he said. They pushed back through the storm to the cabin, shoulder to shoulder again, fighting the rope in the dark. And when they got inside and the door was shut behind them and the wind went from roar to a muffled howl, they stood in the entryway, dripping snow onto the floor and breathing hard. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. They stood there for another moment, and something shifted in the air between them. Not romantic, not yet, nothing as simple as that. Just a recognition. The recognition of two people who had each been dragging a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and had just, accidentally and without planning it, found themselves dragging it in the same direction. She went to her side of the bedroom. He stayed by the stove for a while. The storm continued. The fire burned. The rag in the north wall held. Coulter sat with his cold coffee and his month-old newspaper and the unfamiliar sound of someone else breathing through the wool curtain, and outside, the blizzard pressed down on Iron Ridge like it intended to stay. For once, he didn't mind being inside. The storm didn't break. Coulter had hoped, not with any great conviction, but with the specific stubbornness of a man who had survived enough bad winters to believe that hope was at least worth having. That morning would bring some softening, that the pressure would lift, that the snow would slow to something manageable. Instead, he woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of the north wall doing something it hadn't done before, a low grinding complaint at the foundation joint, and when he pulled on his boots and coat and pushed out the cabin door, the wind hit him in the face with the flat, mean patience of something that had been waiting. He couldn't see the barn. He could see the rope, barely, and he took hold of it and moved hand over hand through the whiteout until the barn door materialized in front of him. Inside, the animals were okay. Unhappy, loud about it, but okay. He watered them in the dark with the lamp turned low, broke the thin skim of ice that had formed on the surface of the barrel, despite the insulation, spread another layer of hay, and talked to Bruiser in a low voice until the horse stopped trying to take a piece out of the stall wall. When he got back inside, Evelyn was up. She was standing at the kitchen stove in her coat over her nightclothes, boots unlaced, feeding wood into the firebox with the focused attention of someone who had decided that the day was going to start, whether or not she was fully prepared for it. She looked at him when he came in, at the snow covering his coat, at his face, which was probably the color of old chalk, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Cattle?" she asked. "Fine. Horses are fine." He pulled the door shut behind him and the wind noise dropped from a scream to a steady moan. "Storm's not letting up." "I know." She closed the stove door. "I've been listening to it for an hour." She moved to the kitchen corner and picked up the coffee pot that she had apparently already started because there was steam coming off it. "How long can it last like this?" "I've seen them go 4 days." She looked at him. 4 days. Sometimes 5. And the animals need checking. Morning and night at minimum, more if the temperature drops further. He hung his coat on the hook near the door. His hands were bad. The cold had gotten into the knuckles in a way that would ache for the rest of the day. "I'll manage it." "We'll manage it," she said, with the mild firmness of someone who had already had this conversation once and was choosing not to be annoyed that she was having it again. He almost argued. He looked at her, the coat over the nightgown, the unlaced boots, the stubborn set of her jaw, and decided that arguing with Evelyn Hart before the sun was even up was a project he lacked the reserves for. "Fine," he said. "We'll manage it." She handed him the coffee. The second day of the storm was harder than the first in a way that was purely psychological. The first day had the quality of a crisis, the urgent, adrenaline-sharpened focus of survival, the sense of immediate problem and immediate response. By the second day, the crisis had become the condition. There was no urgency anymore because there was no end in sight, and the cabin, which was adequate for one person's solitude, was revealing its limitations as a space for two people to occupy with any kind of sustained human dignity. It wasn't that they argued, it was more that the proximity produced a specific low-grade friction, the way two different materials rub against each other, not from hostility, but just from occupying the same space at the same angle. Evelyn had opinions about organization. This was not a criticism. Her opinions were correct mostly. But Coulter had spent 11 years developing a system that worked for him by standards that were largely invisible to anyone else, and watching her quietly rearrange the supply shelf with the calm efficiency of someone who was certain they were improving things was more unsettling than it should have been. "The salt goes next to the flour," she said, in the tone of someone stating an obvious fact. "It was next to the beans. The beans are heavy. They go on the bottom shelf." She moved the salt. "The flour and salt get used together. It makes sense to have them together." "I know where everything is." "You knew where everything was," she said pleasantly. "Now everything is where it makes sense." He picked up his cup and went to sit by the fire and looked into the flames for a while with the expression of a man practicing patience. But then there was the ankle. It happened the second afternoon. She'd been moving between the kitchen and the stove. The cook stove and the fireplace were on opposite sides of the room, which was a design decision Coulter had made in his first year here and had regretted every year since. And she caught the leg of the table wrong. He heard it from the other side of the room, a short, involuntary sound of pain, sharp and quickly suppressed, and when he turned, she was already grabbing the table with both hands, her face doing something complicated. "What happened?" "Nothing." She was breathing through her nose. "I caught my ankle." "Let me—" "It's fine." She straightened up, took a careful step. Her face did the complicated thing again and her hand tightened on the table. "I just twisted it." "Sit down." "I'm in the middle of— Evelyn." He said her name for the first time. Just that. She stopped, looked at him. He said more quietly, "Sit down and let me look at it." She sat down, reluctantly, with the specific body language of someone who considered accepting help a form of debt they weren't sure they could service. He crouched in front of her and she held very still while he took off her boot with the kind of care that came from having handled injured animals long enough to know that gentleness and speed were not opposites. The ankle was already swelling. Not broken. He'd seen broken, and this wasn't it, but the kind of bad sprain that would make weight-bearing a serious problem for the next several days. "It's a sprain," he said. "I know what it is. You need to stay off it." She looked at him with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral. "The animals still need checking twice a day." "I'll do that." "The fire needs—" "I'll do that too." "Coulter." She said his name the same way he'd said hers. Just that, quiet, stopping him. "You can't do everything alone. That's why I'm here. You can't walk on that ankle." "I can manage," she said. "Managing it wrong for a day will turn a bad sprain into something that doesn't heal right," he said. "I've seen that happen." He paused. "I've had that happen." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire cracked and spit behind him. "What can I do sitting down?" she asked finally. "Keep the fire going, the cook stove, count the food stores, and tell me how long we've got." He put her boot down carefully. "Things that matter and don't require walking." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through the list of things she'd have to cede, all the ways the injury would limit her and how much she disliked being limited. Then she nodded. "Fine," she said. "But you're going to need to wrap it first so it doesn't stiffen." "I know how to wrap an ankle." "Then do it properly," she said. "And don't be gentle about it. Tight wrapping is better." He wrapped it tight. She didn't make a sound. Boy, that night, the third night of the storm, the temperature dropped to something Coulter had only seen twice in 11 years. He knew it by the sound the cabin made, a deep, structural complaint, wood contracting against itself, the fireplace drawing harder as the cold pressed in from every direction. He'd banked the fire before he slept, but he woke at 2 a.m. with the specific cold that meant the fire had dropped too low, and when he checked, the room was maybe 50 degrees. He rebuilt the fire in the dark, moving carefully and quietly. When he turned around, Evelyn was watching him from the doorway of the bedroom, The wool curtain pulled aside, both blankets around her shoulders. It dropped, she said, low, so as not to make the cold feel any more real. I've got it. He fed wood into the fireplace, watching the flames take hold. Go back to sleep. She didn't go back to sleep. She came out and sat in the chair closest to the fire and tucked the blankets tighter and watched the flames with him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The storm sounded different at this hour. Less violent somehow, more patient, like it had settled into something it was prepared to do for a long time. Were you married before? She asked. Shipamad. It came out of the dark and the quiet without preamble, which was the only way a question like that could be asked honestly. He didn't flinch from it. Yes, he said. Her name was Clara. She died in the winter of '81. Here? Here. He kept his eyes on the fire. Fever. I had the doctor from Iron Ridge out twice. Wasn't enough. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He paused. Doesn't always feel like it. No, she said. That kind of thing doesn't. I know. He looked at her. The firelight was doing things to the planes of her face that he was careful not to think about for too long. Did you lose someone? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer, then, my husband, Daniel, 3 years ago. She said the name like it was something she'd learned to hold without cutting herself on. Fever too, actually. She stopped. That's strange, isn't it? Yes. He was sick for 2 weeks. I thought, She stopped again. The fire cracked. I thought he was going to be fine. He seemed better one day, and then the next morning he wasn't, and by afternoon he was gone. The flatness in her voice wasn't coldness. It was the flatness of a story that had been turned over so many times it had worn smooth. The kind of grief that was past crying about, that had moved into the quieter and somehow heavier stage of just being something you carried. Did you have... He started. No children. She said it without waiting for the end of the question. We were trying. It didn't happen. And then he was gone and I was... She looked at her hands. I was in Ohio with a rented house and no income and no family close enough to help and a very clear picture of how few options I had. Coulter was quiet. My letters, she said, the ones I wrote to men who'd placed advertisements. I want you to know that yours wasn't the first. I wrote to 3 others before you. She looked at him steadily, like she was braced for something. I want you to know that because you told me to be honest, and I want to be. What happened with the others? The first one didn't write back. The second wrote back and was... She paused. His letters felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. They just felt wrong. She looked at the fire. The third one? I went to meet. In Kansas. He was nothing like his letters. He was... Another pause. Longer. I left the same day I arrived. He thought about asking what that meant. He looked at her face, at the careful way she'd stopped herself twice, and decided he didn't need to ask. I'm sorry, he said. The point is, she said, and her voice had recovered its evenness, I want you to understand that I came here knowing what I was doing. I wasn't naive about it. I read your letters, and I decided you were someone I could trust, and that wasn't something I decided easily. She met his eyes. So far you haven't proved me wrong. It's been 3 days. I know how to read people quickly, she said. You learn to, when the cost of being wrong is high. He held her look for a moment. Then he looked back at the fire. Clara used to hate how quiet I got, he said. She'd tell me I was like talking to a wall sometimes. He felt the familiar small ache of it. Not sharp anymore, just familiar. She wasn't wrong. I'm not easy to be in a room with. You're not that bad, Evelyn said. You've been here 3 days. 4, counting the night you picked me up. A beat. You make good coffee. That helps. He looked at her. She was looking at the fire, but there was something at the corner of her mouth. The beans are from the general store, he said. I can't take credit. You grind them properly. That's something. They sat for another hour. Not talking much after that. Just sitting, which was different from the silence earlier in the day. The kind that had friction in it. This silence was the other kind. The kind that 2 people make together when they've said enough of the hard things to let the quiet rest easy between them. At some point, the storm outside seemed to breathe in and hold, the way very bad weather sometimes did in the deep hours. Not ending, just pausing in some deep mechanical function. The cabin held its warmth. Eventually, Evelyn's head tipped slightly and her breathing evened out. She was asleep in the chair, both blankets cocooned around her, the bad ankle propped on the footstool he'd quietly moved under it sometime in the last hour. Coulter stayed awake until the fire was well established and the room was stable. He watched the flames and tried not to think about what it meant that having someone else in the room made the cold feel smaller. He was not ready to think about that. He was not sure he had the vocabulary for it yet. He put another log on the fire and went back to bed. By the fourth day, Evelyn had developed a system. She couldn't walk properly. The ankle was truly bad, and she'd given up pretending otherwise after she'd stood on it wrong in the morning and gone white in the face with a silence that was worse than any sound she could have made. But she'd refused to become a problem. She sat at the table and organized what she could reach and managed the fire from the chair and, in the afternoons, cooked from a seated position with the iron pot on a low stool in front of her, which was awkward and inefficient and produced, nevertheless, the best stew Coulter had eaten in probably 3 years. "What's in this?" he asked the first time. "Salt pork, dried onion, the last of the root vegetables from your cellar." She looked at him across the table. "You have carrots down there going soft. We should use them before they're completely gone." "I know about the carrots." "Then why haven't you used them?" "I was going to." "When?" He looked at his stew. "When they got worse." She stared at him with the patient expression of someone who had encountered this particular variety of domestic neglect before, and had chosen not to make it a hill to die on. "All right," she said, "tomorrow we use the carrots." He did the barn runs alone now, morning and night, and the night runs in particular were becoming something he had to prepare himself for. The temperature had dropped further on day 3 and held there, and the trip from the cabin to the barn was 20 yards of active danger, the kind of cold that could genuinely stop a heart if a man went down and stayed down. He kept the rope in his hands the whole way, both ways, and he kept moving. He was tired. He didn't say this. It would have been useful information for someone who could help, and Evelyn couldn't help with the barn runs until the ankle was better, so saying it was only a way of making her feel the limitation of her injury more acutely, which he had no interest in doing. But on the evening of the 4th day, coming back from the barn with ice in his beard and his hands shaking with the kind of cold that takes time to reason with, he came through the cabin door and stood there for a moment, and she looked at him from the table. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. Coulter." The same way she'd said it before. He sat down. She got up. Carefully, slowly, the ankle bearing just enough weight to get her across the room, and poured him coffee and pushed it into his hands and stood over him with her arms crossed, and a look that was part concern and part stubbornness in equal measure. "You're exhausted," she said. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true enough." She sat down across from him, moving the bad leg carefully. "How much worse does it get? The cold, I mean. Does it drop more from here?" He wrapped his hands around the cup. The heat was almost painful against the cold knuckles. "Usually hits bottom around day 5 or 6, then it starts to come back." He looked at the cup. "If the storm breaks, it'll come back faster." "And if it doesn't break?" "Then it comes back slower." He looked up at her. "But it comes back. It always comes back." She nodded. She was studying him with that quality she had, the direct observation without the social coding, taking him in like information she needed rather than a person she was performing something for. It would have made him uncomfortable with most people. With her, it just felt honest. "My mother used to say," she said, and then stopped. Started again. "She used to say that the hardest thing isn't the hard part. It's the part right before the end of the hard part, when you can't see the end yet and you're most tired." She wasn't wrong. She usually wasn't. She looked at the table. "She died when I was 16. I've been quoting her ever since in situations she never prepared me for." "That sounds like the right way to use what people leave you," he said. She looked up at him. Something moved in her face, a quick, unguarded thing, gone before he could name it. "Yes," she said quietly, "that's exactly it." Outside, the storm pressed down on Iron Ridge with all its full and indifferent weight. The cabin walls held, the fire burned. The rag in the north wall, restuffed that morning, kept the worst of the draft out. Inside, two people who had each been dragging their separate griefs through separate silences sat across from each other in the firelight and drank bad coffee and were, without entirely meaning to be, less alone than they had been in years. The storm broke on the morning of the sixth day, not gently, not with any of the gradual softening that sometimes preceded a clearing, no lightening of the sky, no slowing of the wind by degrees. It broke the way bad things sometimes ended, which was suddenly and without ceremony, like a rope pulled too tight finally giving way. Coulter woke to silence so complete that it woke him the way a sound would have, and he lay there for a moment in the dark with his eyes open, listening to the nothing, before he understood what it meant. He got up and opened the cabin door. The world outside was white and still and enormous. Snow had drifted against the porch railing to chest height, and more had packed against the door itself, so that opening it required shouldering into it. But the sky above the valley was clear, genuinely, brutally clear, the kind of blue that only appeared at altitude in deep winter, sharp enough to hurt if you looked at it too long. The mountain stood in full definition against it. Every pine on the ridge was weighted down with snow, bent under it, and the valley below was unbroken white in every direction. It was beautiful in the specific way that dangerous things sometimes were. He heard Evelyn behind him. She'd come to stand in the doorway, wrapped in both blankets, looking out over his shoulder at the white world. He felt her stillness, the quality of held breath that the landscape produced in people seeing it like this for the first time. "It stopped," she said. "Yes." "When did it stop?" "Sometime in the night." He looked at the drifts. "We've got maybe 3-4 feet of new snow on top of what was already there." He was already calculating the barn, the access route, the cattle. "I need to dig out." "Your ankle," she said, moving past him onto the porch. She tested her weight on the ankle, and he watched her face. She'd been doing that every morning now, the private assessment, checking what the night had given back. "It's better." "Better isn't healed." "Better is enough for today." She turned and looked at him. Her face in the winter morning light was very clear, the shadows under her eyes from 6 days of bad sleep visible and honest, her hair escaping its pin at one temple. "What do we do first?" he told her. The digging out took most of the morning. Coulter went first with the larger shovel, breaking the initial path to the barn, and Evelyn followed behind him with the smaller one, widening it and clearing the porch. She worked without being asked, without narrating what she was doing, just worked, and her ankle was bothering her. He could see it in the way she shifted her weight after every few throws, favoring the right side. But she didn't stop and she didn't mention it, and he knew better by now than to make it a conversation. The barn door had drifted completely over. It took 30 minutes just to clear it. Inside, the animals were alive, which was what mattered. The horses were rough, dull-eyed, unhappy, in need of exercise they hadn't been able to get, but alive. The cattle were thinner than they'd been 6 days ago, which was expected, but all 9 of the remaining head were standing and the water barrel was intact. 9. Coulter counted again. Came up with 9 again. He stood in the middle of the barn and did the arithmetic that he didn't want to do. He'd had 12 cattle when Evelyn arrived, lost 3 in the blizzard before that, but he thought he was starting this storm with the full 9. He walked the stalls again, slowly, and came up with 9 again, and felt the particular cold of a number that was already too small getting smaller. He went back to the cabin without saying anything about it. Evelyn was at the stove when he came in, ladling something into 2 bowls with the careful movements of a person whose ankle was speaking to her, but who had decided not to listen. She looked at him when he came through the door. "How many?" she asked. He stopped. "How'd you know?" "Your face?" She put the bowls on the table. "How many did we lose?" 3. He pulled his coat off. "Maybe more later. 2 of them looked rough." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does that mean for the spring?" "It means a harder spring." He sat down at the table. "We had enough of a margin before. Now the margin's gone." She sat across from him, put her hands around her bowl, and looked at the steam coming off it. He could see her processing it, not panicking, which he'd stopped expecting her to do, just taking the information in and turning it over with the same practical seriousness she brought to everything. "Is there a way to make up the loss?" she asked. "If the calving season's good in spring, if we don't lose more." He looked at his food. A lot of ifs. All right. She picked up her spoon. Then we don't lose more. He looked at her. She said it like it was a decision rather than a hope, and he wasn't sure whether that was foolish or the most useful possible way to think about it. And he decided, eating his breakfast across from her in the morning quiet, that probably it was both. The silence after the blizzard had a different quality than the silence before it. It was heavier, cleaner, the way the air tasted after 6 days of storm, cold and mineral and knife sharp. It was also, paradoxically, louder. Without the constant assault of the wind, the smaller sounds came back. The creak of cooling snow on the cabin roof, the horses shifting in the barn, the sound of the creek somewhere down the ridge beginning to move again under its ice. And on the second morning after the storm broke, just before dawn, another sound. Coulter heard it from the barn where he'd gone early to check the 2 cattle that had been looking rough. He stood very still in the thin pre-dawn dark and listened, and the sound came again, low, carried from the valley floor, rising at the end. A howl. Then another, slightly different, from a different direction. He went back to the cabin fast. Evelyn was at the table with her coffee, which she'd started making first thing every morning now, with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that this particular ritual was non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. She looked at him when he came in. "What?" she said. "Wolves." He went to the rifle on the wall, his, a Winchester that he'd owned for 8 years and trusted absolutely, and checked the load. "Down in the valley, 2, maybe more." She was very still for a moment. "The cattle. They're penned. But if the wolves are hungry enough..." He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. She understood what hungry wolves and weakened cattle and broken fences added up to. "I need to ride down and check the far fence line. The snow may have taken down a section." "I'll come." "Your ankle..." "I can ride," she said. Riding isn't walking. She was already standing, moving toward her coat with that quality she had of making decisions and then immediately enacting them, not waiting for permission or consensus. "Evelyn." He said it carefully. "If the wolves are already at the fence, then you need someone who can keep watch while you work." She put her coat on, looked at him steadily. "I can shoot. I told you in my second letter." He remembered. He'd read it twice. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went and got the second rifle from under the bed. A shorter carbine, older than the Winchester, but reliable, and handed it to her without another word. Something moved in her expression. Not triumph, not quite. More like the specific relief of being taken seriously. "Thank you," she said. They rode down into the valley in the early gray light, the horses' breath steaming in the cold, the snow so deep in places that the horses were working hard through it, lunging rather than stepping. Evelyn rode Tuesday. The gray mare who had taken, over the past week, a particular opinion about Evelyn that manifested as the horse following her around the barn with the devoted attentiveness of a large, opinionated dog. She rode well, her bad ankle angled slightly to minimize the pressure in the stirrup, the carbine across the front of the saddle. The valley was vast and white and breathtaking in the early light, and Coulter had exactly no capacity to appreciate any of that because he was watching the tree line and the tree line was watching back. He saw the tracks before he saw the fence. Wolf tracks, a set of them, crossing the snow from the eastern tree line toward the cattle pasture in a line that was not a wander, but a vector, deliberate, purposeful. He counted the tracks as he rode alongside them. 4 distinct sets, maybe 5. The stride length was long. "They came in last night," he said. Evelyn was reading the tracks too, he realized. She'd slowed Tuesday and was looking down at the snow with the same focused assessment she brought to everything. "They stopped here," she said, pointing to a churned section of snow 20 yards ahead, where the tracks converged and circled. "Waited." "Scouting the fence," he said. The fence, when they reached it, was exactly what he'd been afraid of. A section on the northeast corner had come down, 2 posts pushed over by the weight of snow accumulating against them, the wire bowed and half buried. It wasn't a large gap, but it was a gap. "How long to fix it?" Evelyn asked. "An hour if I have the right posts in the saddlebag, which I do." He was already dismounting. "Maybe less." She swung down from Tuesday, handling the landing carefully on the bad ankle, and took the reins of both horses. She positioned herself with her back to him and the carbine held across her body, facing the tree line, which was maybe 150 yards east. He got to work. The work was the kind that required swearing at it periodically to be done properly. Frozen ground, wire that had been under tension for 6 days of storm and had developed opinions about being retensioned, post-hole work in soil that had frozen to something approaching the hardness of iron. His hands were bad within 10 minutes. He kept working. Behind him, Evelyn said nothing. She stood with the horses and watched the tree line, and he was aware of her the way you were aware of a fixed point, as a reference, as something reliable and present in the corner of attention. He was 2/3 done when she said, quietly and without alarm, "Coulter." He looked up. At the tree line, just at the edge of the shadow where the pines met the snow, something moved. Several somethings. The low gray-brown slide of large animals coming out of cover, moving low and easy with the specific unhurried confidence of predators who had not yet decided to commit. He counted 5. "Keep working," she said, still quiet. "There, I see them. Keep working. Fast." He kept working. He drove the second post with his full weight behind it, twice, 3 times, the impact running up his arms into his already aching shoulders, and he heard the horses shift behind him, Bruiser going tense, Tuesday stamping, and he was hammering the wire back into tension with hands that were shaking with cold and effort. The wolves were moving. Not fast. Not yet. They came across the snowfield in that particular wolf way that was almost casual and absolutely not casual, fanning out slightly as they moved, the largest one in front, its head low and its eyes catching the early light. "Almost done," Coulter said. He was saying it to himself as much as to her. "Take your time," she said, which was a lie, delivered in a level voice, and he appreciated the lie. He got the last wire section up. Not perfectly. It would need proper work in the spring. This was a winter repair. Barely enough. But up. He started for the horses. The lead wolf stopped 30 yards out. It was enormous, the biggest he'd seen in 11 years in this valley, heavy through the shoulders, its gray coat thick with winter, its eyes amber-colored and completely without alarm. It looked at him with the particular interest of something that had learned to read the difference between a threat and a meal. Coulter reached the horses, took Bruiser's reins. The horse was shaking. "If I fire a warning shot," Evelyn said, not looking at him, still looking at the wolves, "will they run or will it provoke them?" "Should run." He swung up onto Bruiser. "But this one," he looked at the lead wolf. It hadn't moved. "This one's bold." "Bold," she said. "All right." She raised the carbine to her shoulder, aimed high and left, well clear of the animals, into the sky above the tree line, and fired. The crack of it was enormous in the winter silence. Every wolf bolted except the lead one. The 4 others disappeared into the trees in a gray blur of motion, gone in seconds. The leader took 3 steps back, stopped, and looked at them. Evelyn worked the lever on the carbine without taking her eyes off it. The second round was chambered. She kept the rifle up. The wolf looked at her. She looked at the wolf. Then it turned, with the deliberateness that managed to convey something almost like dignity, and walked back toward the trees at its own pace, not fleeing, just departing, as if the visit had concluded on its own terms. It disappeared into the shadows. Evelyn lowered the carbine, let out a long, controlled breath through her nose. "Is it gone?" Coulter asked. "For now." She looked at the tree line for another moment, making sure. Then she turned to the horses, running a hand down Tuesday's neck where the mare was still trembling. "It'll come back. Probably tonight." He was scanning the valley, the herd in the distance, all accounted for from what he could see, the fence holding. "We'll need to keep them in the barn tonight. All the cattle." She nodded. Her face was flushed with cold and the aftermath of something, not quite fear, more like the specific high alertness of a situation that required everything and got it. Her hands, he noticed, were steady. She was already putting the carbine back across her saddle. "You're not scared," he said. It came out more observationally than he'd intended. She looked at him. "I was scared. I'm just done being scared now." A pause. "There's a difference." He looked at her, across the horses in the cold white morning. Her coat covered in frost, her ankle bad, a rifle she'd just used with perfect judgment across the saddle in front of her, 5 wolves between them and the tree line running the other way, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel today, or possibly any day this winter. He felt something give way in his chest, not breaking, nothing so dramatic as that, more like a door that had been latched against the weather for a very long time, deciding, finally, that the weather had changed enough to open. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't ready to say anything about it. "Let's get the cattle in," he said. It took the better part of the afternoon working together, him cutting the cattle from the near pasture while Evelyn, riding on the bad ankle without mentioning it, pushed them from the other side. The animals were difficult, as storm-worn animals always were, irritable, uncooperative, inclined to scatter exactly when you needed them to converge. He lost his temper at one point, a genuine and unguarded loss of it, shouting at a heifer who had taken a personal interest in going in the wrong direction, and the shouting didn't help, and the heifer continued in the wrong direction, and he had to circle back. Evelyn passed him going the other way, and as she did, she said, without breaking stride, "She responds better to pressure from the left." "I know how to work cattle," he said. "I know you do," she said pleasantly. "I'm just telling you what I noticed." He tried it from the left. The heifer moved. He said nothing about this. She said nothing about it either, but he heard from somewhere behind him the sound she made that was in the neighborhood of a laugh, but always contained itself before it got all the way there. By the time they had all 9 cattle in the barn, reorganized, doubled up in stalls, unhappy but contained, the light was going. The valley was turning the pale gold pink of winter sunset, shadows stretching long across the snow, the mountains going amber at their peaks. The wolf tracks from the morning were still visible, crossing the white field, converging and spreading back toward the trees. Evelyn stood in the barn doorway and looked at the valley as the color changed. He came to stand beside her because there was room in the doorway for 2 people, and he'd stopped bothering with pretexts for proximity. "They'll come back tonight," she said. "Yes." "What do we do?" "One of us takes the watch. First half, then second." He looked at the tree line. "Somebody stays awake." She looked at him sideways. "Your ankle's fine. Mine isn't." "I'll take first watch." "No." She straightened up. "I'll take first watch. I slept better last night. You've been on 2 weeks of bad sleep, and you need the first half more than I do." She looked at him with that specific Evelyn expression that was reasonable and immovable at the same time. "Wake me at 2. I'll take it from there." He wanted to argue. He could feel the argument available to him, the instinct to insist, "I'm fine, I'll manage, I don't need—" all the familiar language of a man who'd been managing alone long enough that accepting help had started to feel like an accusation. But he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he thought about the wolf and the carbine, and the way she'd held that rifle up, without her hands shaking, and about 9 cattle in the barn instead of the 12 he'd started with, and about the spring that was coming that was going to require everything both of them had. 2 o'clock, he said. "I'll wake you." "Good." They went inside. He built up the fire. She heated the last of the stew, and they ate it at the table in the lamplight, and when he went back out for the first watch, the valley was dark and cold and silent under the stars. He sat on the porch with the Winchester across his knees and listened. The wolves didn't come that night. He heard them, once, somewhere east of the valley. The long, rolling call moving through the mountains like something the dark said to itself when it thought nobody was listening. But they didn't come. At 2, he went inside and woke Evelyn, who was awake before he'd fully crossed the room, already dressed, already reaching for her coat with the automatic efficiency of someone who had not fully slept but had been waiting. She took the rifle from him at the door, checked the load the way she always checked things, with that quick and thorough sureness. "Anything?" she asked. "East Ridge, moving away." She nodded, went outside. He lay down on the bed and was asleep in 3 minutes. When he woke at gray dawn, she was sitting on the porch with the rifle across her knees and Tuesday's old horse blanket around her shoulders, watching the valley come back into light. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. The dark of her hair against the pale sky, the set of her shoulders, the absolute stillness of a person who had kept watch through the cold night and found in it something that wasn't unpleasant. She turned when she heard him. "Nothing," she said. "They were out there. I could hear them, but they stayed in the trees." "Good." She stood up, handed him the rifle. For a moment they were standing very close, the exchange happening between them, and she looked at him in the gray morning light with an expression he had no language for yet. Something open. Something that had been in the process of being said for several days without either of them quite finishing the sentence. He took the rifle. Their fingers overlapped for a moment on the barrel in the cold. Neither of them moved away immediately. "Coffee?" she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. They went inside. The wolves came back twice more that week. The first time was 2 nights after the blizzard broke. A probe, Coulter thought, testing the perimeter rather than committing to it. He heard them circling the barn in the dark, the soft crunch of paws on crusted snow. And when he went out with the rifle, the sound stopped and the shadows at the tree line were still and empty-looking in the way that meant they were there, but choosing not to be visible. He fired 1 shot into the air. The sounds didn't come back that night. The second time was more serious. It was midday, which surprised him. Wolves in this valley had always been creatures of the early dark, and a midday approach meant hunger had overridden their usual caution. He was at the far fence line doing proper repairs on the section he'd patched during the crisis, working the post hole digger in ground that was still iron hard and arguing with it, when he heard the cattle in the barn start up with the low, distressed sound that meant something was wrong with the air. He got back to the barn fast. 3 wolves were at the near fence, the section closest to the barn, the section in good repair, testing it with the specific methodical attention of animals who had done this before and had opinions about fence integrity. The cattle inside were against the far wall, pushed together, and the horses were bad. He got 2 shots off before the wolves broke. They ran, which was the right outcome, but they ran into the eastern tree line rather than back over the ridge, which meant they were staying in the valley, which meant this wasn't over. That evening at the table, he told Evelyn what this meant. "We can't keep them in the barn indefinitely," he said. "They need pasture. They need to move." He put his coffee cup down. "And we can't ride watch every day. We both got other work." She was quiet, thinking. Her ankle was measurably better. She was walking on it properly now, or close to properly, still with a careful quality to her stride that would probably last another week. She'd stopped talking about it, which was its own indicator. "The Doyles," she said. "Frank and May. How far south did you say they were?" "Half-day's ride." "Do they have a rifle?" "Frank has 3. Could he spare a day? 2 people riding pasture watch is better than 1. She looked at Coulter. "And May would probably want to know about the wolf problem. She'd want to know about all of it, I imagine." Coulter looked at her. There was something lightly self-aware in the way she'd said that last part, acknowledging the subtext, which was that May Doyle had been corresponding with Evelyn before she'd arrived, and would have views about how things were going that she'd been waiting 3 weeks to express. "May would want to come herself," he said. "I know." A pause. "That's fine with me if it's fine with you." He thought about May Doyle descending on the cabin with her basket and her observations and her particular talent for knowing things about people that they hadn't told her. He thought about how that would have felt 3 weeks ago, before the storm, before the wolves, before the long nights, and the coffee and the things said in firelight that he hadn't planned to say. "It's fine," he said. She nodded. "Then ride down tomorrow. I can manage a day here." "I'll be back by dark." "I know you will." She picked up her cup. "I'll be here." He rode to the Doyle place the next morning, and May Doyle had him through the door and sitting at her kitchen table with a bowl of something hot in front of him before he'd fully dismounted, which was a talent unique to May and which he'd given up trying to resist years ago. Frank was outside doing something to a fence post that apparently required a great deal of cursing, and May sat across from Coulter with her hands folded and her expression doing what it always did, which was being simultaneously warm and penetrating in a way that he'd never fully gotten comfortable with. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "How is she?" "She's well. Ankle's healing. She wrote me about the ankle." May tilted her head slightly. "She also wrote me that you were going to kill yourself doing the barn runs alone and wouldn't accept help about it." "I accepted help." Eventually. May had an economy of expression that could convey significant skepticism with very little movement. "How are you, Coulter?" He wrapped his hands around the bowl. Outside, Frank said something pointed to the fence post. "Fine," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." He looked at her. She looked back with the patient directness of a woman who had known him for 8 years and had no particular interest in pretending she hadn't. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the honest version. May nodded slowly. "She sounds like a serious person, in her letters." "She is." "Good serious," or "good serious." He said it without hesitation, which he noticed, and which he thought May also noticed. "She's—" He stopped, started again. "She doesn't make things harder, which is more than I expected." May said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of response. "Frank will come up tomorrow," she said, finally, "for the wolf watch." She stood, which meant the conversation was concluding on her terms, which was how May's conversations always concluded. "And I'll come Thursday to see how the cabin's holding." "You want to see her," he said. "I want to see both of you," May said firmly, and put more food in his bowl without asking. Frank came the next morning, arriving with his particular brand of cheerful noise and 2 extra rifles and a great deal of unsolicited opinion about wolf management that Coulter largely agreed with but wasn't going to say so. Frank Doyle was the kind of man who needed to be right about things slightly more than he needed to be thanked for things, which balanced out to a working friendship if you managed it correctly. He met Evelyn in the barn, where she was doing the morning water check, and Coulter watched the meeting from the doorway with the low-grade tension of a man waiting for something he couldn't control. Evelyn turned from the water barrel, saw Frank, and said, "Mr. Doyle," in a direct and ordinary way, without the performance of warmth that some people deployed when meeting someone they needed to impress. Frank looked at her. He looked at Coulter. He looked back at her. "You fixed the north wall," Frank said, pointing at the chinking that Evelyn had done properly, with the material she'd made Coulter locate, on the second day after the storm. "It was drafting," she said. Coulter's been meaning to fix that for 2 years." "I know," she said pleasantly. Frank looked at Coulter with an expression that contained a great deal of information, compressed. Coulter ignored it absolutely. They rode the wolf watch together, the 3 of them in rotating shifts over the next 2 days, and the wolves, whether from the rifles or the increased human presence or some calculation of their own, stayed in the tree line. By the 3rd day, the cattle were back in the near pasture, and the horses were calmer, and the specific anxiety of the wolf situation had settled from emergency to ongoing concern, which was manageable. Frank left on the morning of the 3rd day with the particular reluctance of a man who wanted to stay and observe things but had animals of his own and couldn't justify it. He shook Coulter's hand at the horses, started to say something, and then seemed to decide against it, and got on his horse instead. He'd ridden 20 yards down the track when he turned back. "May's coming Thursday," he called. "I know," Coulter said. Frank looked at him with the same compressed expression as before, then nodded once and rode south. So, May Doyle arrived Thursday with a basket and opinions, as predicted. She and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, while Coulter was deliberately occupied outside doing maintenance on the barn roof that probably could have waited, and he could hear the murmur of their voices through the cabin wall without being able to make out the words, which was probably the appropriate amount of information. When he came back inside at noon, the cabin smelled like the apple cake that May always made when she came visiting, which appeared to require ingredients that Coulter had not been aware he owned. May was at the stove. Evelyn was at the table with a cup of tea, and her face had the slightly softer quality of someone who had just spent 2 hours being seen by a person who looked at them straight. May stayed for supper. She was tactful enough not to make anything obvious, but she watched the 2 of them across her plate with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose judgment had been confirmed, and Coulter found, to his own surprise, that he didn't particularly mind being observed. After May left, riding south in the last of the daylight, Evelyn stood on the porch and watched her go. Coulter came to stand beside her. "She loves you," Evelyn said. "She's known me a long time." "That's what I mean." She turned to look at the valley, where the snow was catching the last pale gold of the afternoon light. "She was worried about you, before I came. May worries about everyone." "She worries about you specifically," Evelyn said, in a tone that wasn't going to let him deflect this one. She said that the winters had been taking things from you, and she wasn't sure how many more you had left to give. He was quiet for a moment. The valley below was very still, the cold coming back as the light died. "She wasn't wrong," he said finally. Evelyn looked at him. The evening light was doing things to her face, and he looked back steadily, which was something that had gotten easier over 3 weeks and was simultaneously getting harder in a different way. "I know," she said. "She also said—" She stopped. "She said you were a man worth the trouble." Her words. He didn't know what to do with that. He looked at the valley for a moment. "May exaggerates," he said. "She really doesn't," Evelyn said. "That's one of the things I like about her." 3 days before Christmas, Coulter rode into Iron Ridge for supplies. It was his first time off the ranch since picking Evelyn up at the depot, and the town felt strange to him in the way that limited spaces always did after time in open country. Too contained, too loud with even its small noises, the smell of the saloon and the general store, and the coal smoke from the blacksmiths too present and too various. He got what he needed from the general store, nodded to Aldous Pemberton at the depot, who was clearly dying to ask questions that Coulter had no intention of answering, and was almost to the horses when he stopped. He stood outside the land office for a moment. Then he went inside. Hector Graves, who managed the land records for the county, looked up from his desk with mild surprise at a customer in December. Coulter told him what he wanted. Hector looked at him for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something. "You sure about this?" Hector asked. "Write it up," Coulter said. It took an hour. He rode home with the document in his coat pocket, folded carefully, the paper already soft from being handled more than once during the ride. He didn't take it out when he got back. He put it in the drawer of the side table and went to help with the evening barn work and ate supper and went to bed, and the document stayed in the drawer. He wasn't sure yet how to say what needed to be said alongside it. He needed to think about that. Christmas Eve was clear and cold and still. Evelyn had found a way to make the cabin look different. Not decorated exactly, because there was nothing to decorate with beyond what was already there, but arranged differently. The table moved slightly, a branch of pine on the windowsill that she'd brought in from outside, the lamp trimmed and burning better than usual. These were small changes. They made the room feel like a different place than it had been in November, which was not entirely about the pine branch. She'd made a proper supper, the best meal that had come out of that kitchen in Coulter's memory, which included venison from the deer he'd taken in late November, roasted with the dried herbs she'd found in his kitchen that he'd completely forgotten buying. He didn't ask where she'd learned to cook like that. It seemed like information with sadness attached to it, and Christmas Eve wasn't the night for that particular conversation. They ate at the good table with the lamp between them, and it was different from the suppers that had come before. Not tense, not careful, not the polite transaction of two people figuring out the terms of cohabitation. It was just two people eating a good meal and talking, and somewhere in the past 3 weeks the talking had become something he looked forward to the way he'd once looked forward to the spring, as a specific, particular thing that he missed when it wasn't there. After supper, he did the dishes, which he'd been doing since her ankle, and she sat at the table with her tea and watched the fire, and when he was done he dried his hands and went to the side table and took out the document. He put it on the table in front of her. She looked at it, looked at him, looked back at it, and picked it up carefully. He watched her read it. She read slowly. Not because she read slowly, he'd learned, but because she read carefully, the way she did everything. When she finished, she held the paper for a moment without looking up. "This is a land deed," she said. "Yes." "It has my name on it." She looked up. Her expression was doing something complicated that he couldn't fully read. "It has my name on the deed to this ranch." "Beside mine," he said. "It's not a transfer. It's a joint ownership." "I know what it is." She put the paper down very carefully on the table. "Coulter. I want you to have it," he said, "not because of the arrangement, not because of the advertisement or what we agreed to, because—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "Because you fought for this land like it was yours. In the storm, and with the cattle, and with the wolves. You fought for it before it was yours in any legal sense." He looked at her steadily. "It should be." She was very still. The firelight was moving on her face, and she was looking at him with an expression that had come apart somewhat from its usual composure. Not dramatically, but enough. The careful held-togetherness of her, the specific containment that he'd watched her maintain through storms and injury and cold and wolves, had eased in some fundamental way. "That's—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly, and she looked at the table for a moment, and he understood she was managing something. Then she looked back up. That's the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. It's just paperwork. Don't do that, she said, not angry, quiet. Don't make it smaller than it is. He held her look. All right. I need to... She stopped, looked at him in a way that had something different in it, something she was building toward. Can I ask you for something? Yes. One thing, in return for this. She put her hand flat on the deed. I need you to ask me properly. He looked at her. You didn't ask me, she said. Her voice was very even, but her eyes were doing something that was not even at all. We wrote letters, and I came here, and it was an arrangement, and I understood what it was. But you just gave me half your land, and I need... She stopped. I need this to be a choice. A real one, not a transaction. She looked at him. Do you understand what I'm asking? He understood. He'd understood for a while now, he realized, since the barn, and the wolves, and her hands not shaking, since the firelight conversations, since the morning her head had tipped sideways in the chair, and he'd watched her sleep with the specific watching of a man who is trying not to know something about himself. He pushed the chair back from the table. He went down on one knee, which was not comfortable on the stone floor, and he took her hand from where it was resting on the deed, and he looked up at her. Evelyn Hart, he said, I am not an easy person. I go quiet when I should talk, and I take too long to fix things that need fixing. And I have spent 11 years developing habits that are not all worth keeping. He held her hand. It was shaking slightly now, which was the first time he'd seen her hands shake. But I want to keep you, not because I need someone, because I want you specifically, because you're the first person I've been in a room with in years who makes the room feel different. He paused. That's not nothing to me. That's everything. Her eyes were bright. I'm asking you to marry me, he said. Not for the winter, for good. For a moment she didn't say anything, and the fire cracked and the lamp held steady, and outside Iron Ridge lay silent and white under its Christmas Eve sky. Then she exhaled, a long, uneven breath, and laughed, which surprised him. And it was the laugh he'd been catching the edge of for 3 weeks, the real one, and it was better than he'd imagined. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. She pulled him up by the hand because the stone floor was clearly not designed for this, and he stood up, and they were very close, and her eyes were wet, and she was still smiling. Took you long enough, she said. I was thinking about how to say it. You said it fine. I forgot half of it. You said enough. She looked at him, the document on the table behind her, the fire behind him, the pine branch on the windowsill between them. You said exactly enough. He kissed her then, which was both inevitable and slightly clumsy. He misjudged the angle slightly. She moved at the same moment he did, and they sorted it out between them without making it a catastrophe, which felt, honestly, like the right way for it to happen. Not a scene from a story. Just two people in a room that had finally become something more than a place to survive in. They rode to the Doyle homestead on Christmas morning under a sky so blue it was almost violent. May Doyle cried when Evelyn showed her the deed and then denied crying, and Frank shook Coulter's hand for a long time and didn't say anything at all, which from Frank was the most serious possible expression of feeling. May's eldest son, 12 years old and deeply suspicious of all adult proceedings, consented to witness the small ceremony on condition that he be allowed to go back to feeding the horses immediately afterward, which seemed fair. There was no reverend in Iron Ridge until the spring circuit brought one through, so it was Hector Graves from the land office, who had some justice of the peace standing that he was quietly proud of, who said the necessary words in May Doyle's kitchen with the smell of apple cake in the air and the sound of Frank's younger children periodically crashing into things in the next room. It was not elegant. Evelyn's dress was her second best one, worn before in Ohio and carrying the specific patina of a garment that had seen real life. Coulter had managed a clean shirt and his good coat, and the ring, bought from the general store in Iron Ridge, was plain silver with a slight irregularity on one side, where the sizing had been adjusted. She looked at it when he put it on her finger. It's slightly crooked, she said. I know. Graves said they could fix it in the spring. I don't want it fixed, she said. And she meant it. He could tell she meant it, the way she turned her hand slightly and looked at the ring with an expression that had nothing complicated in it. Just ease. Just something finally settled. May Doyle fed everyone until eating more was medically ill-advised, and Frank opened a bottle of something that he claimed was whiskey, and which was probably more correctly described as his best effort at whiskey. And they sat around the table in the Doyle kitchen until the afternoon light started going, and the ride home needed to start. At the door, May hugged Evelyn in a way that lasted longer than a departing hug usually lasted, and said something quiet into her hair that Coulter didn't hear. Evelyn's arms tightened around her for a moment before she let go. Outside, getting the horses, Frank came to stand next to Coulter in the cold. "You did good," Frank said. "She did good," Coulter said. Frank thought about this. "Both, then." "Both," Coulter agreed. The ride home was quiet and cold and good. They rode close enough that their horses' shoulders occasionally touched, and Evelyn wore the ring on her left hand and didn't put her glove back over it for the first several miles, until the temperature made it impractical. The mountains were enormous and still around them, and the sky above was going dark blue to the east, while the west still held its cold gold. At the crest of the ridge, before the cabin came into view, Evelyn pulled Tuesday to a stop. He stopped beside her, looked at what she was looking at. The valley below, the cabin roof just visible with its chimney, the near pasture where the cattle were moving slow and dark against the white, the fence lines, the barn, all of it contained by the mountains on every side. "It's a hard place," she said. "Yes. I knew it would be." She was still looking at the valley. "I'm not sorry. About coming here?" She turned and looked at him with the direct, clear look that he'd come to think of as simply her. No performance, no management, just her looking at him and meaning it. "About any of it," she said. He looked back. The cold was deep and the light was going, and they had a barn to check and a fire to build, and a winter is still several months from finished, and none of that felt the way it had felt before. "Neither am I," he said. They rode down toward home. January was brutal in the specific way that January in the high country always was. Not the dramatic violence of the December blizzard, but something more sustained and grinding, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself with storms, but simply settled in and refused to leave. The temperature dropped to places the thermometer outside the cabin door seemed reluctant to register, and it stayed there for days at a time, and the work of keeping the ranch alive became the entire shape of every day. They lost 2 more cattle in January. The first was the heifer who'd given Coulter trouble in the pasture, the one Evelyn had told him to approach from the left. She'd been struggling since the blizzard, and they'd both known it, doing what they could with extra feed and shelter, but the cold took her on the 8th of January, on a morning so still that the air itself seemed frozen solid. Coulter found her in the barn before Evelyn was up, and he stood there for a while in the cold dark before he went inside. Evelyn was at the stove when he came through the door. She looked at his face and said nothing for a moment. "Which one?" she asked. "The heifer." She turned back to the stove. Her shoulders were very set. "And the others?" "The others are holding." He pulled off his coat. "So far." She put a cup of coffee on the table without looking at him. He sat down. They didn't talk about it further, which wasn't avoidance. It was just that there was nothing useful to say. The heifer was gone. The other 8 were not. The math of the situation hadn't changed in any way that talking would improve. The second loss came 11 days later, one of the older steers, and that one Evelyn found herself on the morning water check. And when she came back inside, her face was doing the careful, neutral thing that meant she was managing something she hadn't finished processing. He'd learned to read that expression the way you learn to read weather. The particular quality of her stillness, the way she held herself when feeling something she wasn't ready to release. "The old steer," she said. "I figured." He'd heard it in the way she'd come through the door. "I'll move him out of the barn this morning." "I already did," she said. He looked at her. She was already at the stove, her back to him, and he thought about saying something and decided instead to go to her and put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, brief and without pressure. She stilled under it. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and he went to get his coat. 7 cattle. Down from 12 when she arrived, down from the 9 they'd had going into the worst of it. 7 was not enough for comfort. 7 was a number that required the spring to go well in ways that springs were not always obliging about. That was the hard arithmetic of January, and they lived inside it together. February came and the cold held, but the light started changing. It was a small thing, 20 minutes more of daylight by mid-month, the sun climbing a degree or two higher before it gave up and retreated. But Coulter had spent enough winters in this valley to know that the light was the first thing to come back, long before the temperature followed. He noticed it without saying anything, in the way that you noticed the first signs of a thing you'd been waiting for and were afraid to name too early. Evelyn noticed it too. He knew because one morning she stood on the porch with her coffee and tilted her face up toward the sun, thin as it was, cold as it still was, with her eyes closed for a moment, just receiving it. She didn't know he was watching. He was standing in the barn doorway with a bucket in his hand, and he watched her do it, and felt something in his chest that he'd stopped trying to classify and had started simply accepting as the ongoing condition of being married to Evelyn Hayes. She'd taken his name without discussion, which had surprised him. He'd expected some negotiation about it. She'd been Hart for her whole life, and for her years with Daniel, and names carried weight, and he hadn't assumed. But she'd signed the land deed with her new name as soon as he told her what the joint ownership looked like officially, and when May Doyle had addressed a letter to Mrs. Hayes, Evelyn had read it without any visible pause. "Does it bother you?" he'd asked once, carefully. "The name." She'd looked up from the letter. "Why would it?" "You were Hart for a long time." "I was Hart when I was alone," she said. "I'm Hayes now." She said it with the matter-of-fact quality she brought to things that were decided. They're different things. He'd thought about that for a while afterward. The specific things she'd said. When I was alone. Not when I was married to Daniel, though that was true, but when I was alone. The distinction was hers, deliberate and considered, and he understood it was not a dismissal of what had come before, but an honest accounting of what it had felt like from the inside. He understood that accounting. He'd been doing his own version of it. "Mom," the calving started in early March, and it started badly. The first calf came 3 weeks early, born in the night, and when Coulter got to the barn at 4 in the morning, the cow was down and the calf was alive. But the situation was bad enough that he spent the next 2 hours on his knees in the straw, doing the kind of work that made his back hate him for a week. He got them both through it. The cow was weak and the calf was small, but by the time the gray dawn came through the barn slats, both of them were upright and the calf had nursed. He came back inside filthy and exhausted, and Evelyn was awake, had been awake, sitting at the table with the lamp on and her coat over her nightclothes. "Both?" she asked. "Both." He went straight to the wash basin. "Cow's going to need watching for a few days." "I'll watch her." She got up and put water on for coffee. "Go to bed." "It's nearly morning." "Go to bed for 2 hours," she amended. "You're useless when you haven't slept and you know it." He looked at her. 2 hours, she said, in the tone that was reasonable and immovable in equal parts. The tone he'd learned was the end of negotiations. "I'll wake you if anything changes in the barn." He went to bed. She woke him 2 hours later, and the cow was fine, and the small early calf, who they ended up calling February, which Evelyn thought was a poor name and Coulter thought was a perfectly adequate name for an animal born in the wrong month, survived into a surprisingly determined small life. By mid-March, they had 4 calves. By April, 6. 6 new calves against the 7 remaining adults brought them to 13 head going into spring, which was not where they'd been before the blizzard winter, but was better, measurably, meaningfully better, than where they'd been in January when the arithmetic of the situation had pressed down on both of them in ways neither had said out loud. 13, Evelyn said, one evening, looking at the figure she'd written in the ledger she'd started keeping in January. She had a system for the ledger: feed costs, animal weights, projected calving, weather notes, that was more organized than anything Coulter had managed in 11 years of running the ranch. He'd looked at the ledger once without asking, and she'd caught him and given him a look. And he'd asked properly after that, and she'd walked him through it with the focused patience of someone who had opinions about financial organization and was glad to share them. 13, he confirmed, looking over her shoulder. If we keep 6 of the calves through the summer, she made a note. That's potential. That's something to build on. Depends on the summer. Everything depends on something. She looked at the figures. But it's better than January. Yes, he said. It's better than January. She looked up at him over her shoulder. There was something in her expression that was part satisfaction and part something else. A kind of quiet wonder, maybe. At the distance between where they'd been and where they were now, measured not in months but in the specific texture of each hard day that had accumulated between those 2 points. He put his hand on the back of her chair. She went back to the ledger. Spring arrived in the valley the way springs in that country always arrived. Not all at once, but in installments, each one partial and sometimes reversed. A warm week in April followed by 3 days of hard frost that killed half the new shoots Evelyn had started in the window boxes she'd constructed from scraps in February. A snowfall on the 5th of May that she stood on the porch and regarded with a personal offense that Coulter found quietly entertaining. The creek below the north pasture flooding its banks in the melt and taking out a section of fence that he and Frank Doyle spent a miserable morning in cold, knee-deep water repairing. But the light kept building. The ground softened. The aspens on the east ridge came out in their small, insistent green, and the cattle moved through the near pasture with the specific ease of animals back in their right element, and the wolf activity had dropped to nothing since February. Either the pack had moved further east into deeper wilderness, or had recalculated the cost-benefit of Iron Ridge Valley and found it unfavorable. On the first genuinely warm Saturday in May, Evelyn planted her garden. She'd been planning it since January. He knew this because she'd taken a corner of his one functional shelf and covered it with sketches and notes, seed envelopes she'd ordered through the general store mail service, a hand-drawn grid of the plot she'd chosen on the south side of the cabin. He'd given her the south side without being asked, which she'd noticed and thanked him for once, briefly, and then they'd not discussed it further. He watched her work from the fence he was repairing nearby, because the fence legitimately needed repairing, and the fact that the work put him within sightline of the garden was incidental. She worked on her knees in the soft-turned earth with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and her hair was doing its usual thing of escaping its pin on the left side by mid-morning, and she had dirt on her cheek from where she'd pushed her hair back without thinking. "You're watching," she said, without looking up. "I'm fixing the fence." "You've been fixing that same post for 40 minutes. He looked at the post. "It's a complicated post." She sat back on her heels and looked at him over her shoulder with the expression that contained the laugh she still rationed carefully. "Come help me if you want to be useful." He abandoned the post without dignity and came to help with the garden, which he was worse at than her and knew it. And she directed him with the patience of someone who had made a calculation about the value of his company versus the precision of his assistance, and had decided the former justified tolerating the latter. They worked for 2 hours. He was better at the physical parts, the heavy turning of soil, the hauling of water, and she handled everything requiring fine judgment, which was most of it. At one point he planted something in the wrong row, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression of genuine suffering before she told him, gently, to move it. "Tomatoes and beans don't go next to each other," she said. "Why not?" "They compete." She was moving the seedling with a delicacy his hands couldn't manage. Everything needs room to grow without something else taking up all the same space. He watched her settle the seedling into its correct position and firm the earth around it, and thought that this was the kind of thing she said that had more in it than the surface, not because she was being deliberately profound, but because she thought about things with a practical depth that occasionally produced truth as a side effect. "Did your mother garden?" he asked. She smoothed the earth around the seedling and was quiet for a moment. "She tried to. We moved too much." She sat back. "She always said she was going to plant a real garden when we stopped moving. She never stopped long enough." A pause. "I thought about her a lot this winter when I was planning this." He looked at her profile, the side of her face, the honest tiredness in it that had become the baseline of her expression, the specific kind that wasn't unhappiness, but just the accumulated weight of a life that had asked a lot and received complicated answers. "She'd have liked this valley," he said. Evelyn turned to look at him. He'd said it simply, not reaching for anything, and she seemed to receive it the same way. "Yes," she said after a moment, "she would have." In June, Frank Doyle's eldest son rode up the mountain with a letter that had come through the Iron Ridge Depot, addressed to Evelyn Hayes. She took it from the boy with a careful expression that Coulter had learned to recognize as managed anticipation, and she read it alone at the table while he was outside. When he came in for supper, the letter was folded on the table and she was at the stove, and her eyes were slightly red at the edges in a way she clearly thought he hadn't noticed. He noticed. He sat down and waited and didn't ask immediately, because she would tell him when she was ready, and pushing the timeline had never worked with her, and he'd stopped trying. She put supper on the table and sat down and picked up her fork and put it down again. "It was from Daniel's sister," she said, "in Ohio." She looked at the letter. "She's been trying to reach me since I left. It took her a while to find the right address." "Is she all right?" "She's fine. A breath. "She said she wanted me to know that Daniel's family doesn't blame me for leaving, for starting over." She stopped. "I didn't know they blamed me. I didn't know that was the thing I'd been carrying." She looked at him with the slightly undone expression of someone surprised by their own reaction to something. "I didn't know until the letter said it wasn't true." He thought about what to say and found that the true thing was also the simple thing. "You didn't leave him," he said. "He left. You just figured out how to keep going." She looked at him. Her jaw tightened slightly, and she looked down at the table for a moment. "Yes," she said, roughly. "That's exactly it." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a minute in the kitchen with the supper getting slightly cold and the evening light coming through the window and the sound of cattle moving in the near pasture below. Then she squeezed his hand and let go and picked up her fork. "It's good," she said about the food. "You made it," he said. "I know, I'm telling you, it came out well." A pause. "Sometimes I surprise myself." He looked at her across the table, the red still faint at her eyes, her chin up, her fork in her hand and her spine straight, and the particular quality she had of being entirely present in whatever moment she was actually in, not the one behind her or the one ahead, just this one. He thought about 11 Winters Alone. He thought about the advertisement he'd written 4 times before he was satisfied, and the letter that arrived last and late, with its water-damaged corner and its 8-sentence precision that had said more than most people said in pages. He thought about a woman stepping off a train in the iron cold of December with a broken suitcase and haunted eyes, and the specific kind of will that doesn't announce itself. He thought, I almost didn't write back to that letter. The thought arrived with a cold clarity, the way near-miss thoughts did. The full weight of what a different decision would have cost, laid out plainly. He almost hadn't written back because the letter was short, and he'd been suspicious of short because he'd been managing his expectations and keeping them low and small had felt like protection. He'd been wrong about small feeling like protection. Small had just been small. "What are you thinking?" she asked. She'd been watching him think. "That I almost didn't write back to your letter," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" "I did." "Why almost didn't you?" He looked at his plate. "Because it was short, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought short meant you weren't serious." She considered this. "And now?" "Now I think short meant you'd already learned to say exactly what you meant without wasting the space around it." He looked at her. "I think I should have written back first, not last." The corner of her mouth moved. "The others didn't work out," she said. "So it doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he said, "for the record." She looked at him for a moment, then she put her fork down and leaned across the table and kissed him once, briefly and without ceremony, the way she did things, direct, decided, complete. "Noted," she said, and picked her fork back up. The evening Coulter thought about for a long time afterward, the one that settled something in him that had been restless since before Evelyn arrived, maybe since Clara, maybe since before that, came in late June on a night so warm it was almost strange to feel it. He'd been working the far fence until the light gave out, and he came back up the ridge on Bruiser with his back aching and his hands rough and the specific pleasant exhaustion of a day spent doing physical work in good weather, which was a different thing entirely from the exhaustion of those December barn runs. Bruiser moved easily under him, following the trail without guidance, and as they crested the ridge above the cabin, Coulter pulled up without deciding to. The valley spread below him in the last of the evening light. The cabin sat in its clearing with the chimney sending up a thin line of smoke. Supper, Evelyn cooking, the window warm with the lamp she always lit at dusk. The garden was visible from here, the green of it distinct against the dark earth, taller now than it had been in May, moving slightly in the evening air. The cattle were in the near pasture, 7 adults and 6 young ones, 13, moving slow and dark against the grass that had come back from the snow with a ferocity that still surprised him. The way the valley floor went from white to green in the span of weeks every year, as if the winter had never happened at all. The mountains stood around all of it. They were always there, every day. And he'd stopped seeing them the way newcomers saw them, because you couldn't live next to something large for 11 years and keep seeing it fresh. But tonight, in the particular quality of the late June light, gold going to rose going to that deep, clean blue, tonight he saw them. He saw all of it, saw all of... The barn Frank had helped him re-roof in April. The fence lines he and Evelyn had ridden together checking in March. Her on Tuesday with the carbine across the saddle out of habit. Him on Bruiser, both of them talking about the cattle management decisions for the coming year, with the specific engagement of two people who had become, without entirely planning it, genuine partners in a real thing. The north wall of this cabin with its proper chinking, done right this time, done in February when the weather briefly relented enough to work the exterior. Done by both of them, because she'd insisted and he'd learned to stop arguing with her insistence on anything structural. The rope between the cabin and the barn, still strung, still there. The rope he'd put up after the horse in his second winter, the rope they'd both used in the blizzard, holding on hand over hand through the dark and the snow. He thought about what this valley had cost him. He thought about the inventory of losses. Clara, the horse, the 3 cattle in the blizzard before Evelyn arrived, and then the 4 more after. The seasons that had taken something each time and not always given it back. 11 winters of the kind of alone that doesn't feel like solitude, but like the slow erasure of the self. The loss not of company, but of the reason to be a particular person rather than just a function. He thought about what it had given back. He sat on the ridge for a while in the warm evening, Bruiser patient under him, and watched the light change over the valley that had his name, and now had hers too, both of them on the deed at the land office in Iron Ridge, both of them on the fence lines and in the barn, and at the kitchen table, both of them in the rope strung between the cabin and the barn that was there because one winter had been bad enough to require it. The lamp in the window moved slightly. Evelyn crossing the room inside, going about the evening, present and particular and real. He turned Bruiser toward home. When he came through the cabin door, she was at the stove and the smell of supper was good, and the lamp was burning, and the garden was dark outside the window, still growing toward whatever it would become. "Late," she said, stopped on the ridge. He hung his coat. "Looking at the valley." She looked at him over her shoulder with the clear-eyed attention she had, reading whatever his face was doing. "Good-looking or bad-looking?" "Good," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Supper's almost ready." He sat down at the table. The ledger was there, open to a June page in her handwriting. Cattle weights, feed notes, a small calculation in the margin about the fall market value if the calves continued to gain at their current rate. A letter to May Doyle, half-written, folded to one side. A seed envelope from the garden with notes on germination times written in pencil on the back. The evidence of a life being built. Small and specific and real. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. "I need you to know something." He said it plainly, the way she'd taught him to say things, without the space around it, without the build-up. "I know it's been a hard year. I know it wasn't what I advertised." She looked at him with the patient expression that meant she was listening for the thing under the thing. "I know the cabin was colder than I said, and the cattle were fewer than I hoped, and the wolves were something neither of us planned for." He held her look. "I want you to know that I know that." She turned fully from the stove and crossed her arms and looked at him. "Is there a point coming?" "The point is..." He stopped. Tried again. "The point is that I would do all of it again, every bad day of it, because the alternative is the version where I don't write back to your letter, and I don't know how I lived in that version as long as I did." The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the evening, a bird called once and was still. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Her arms were still crossed, but her expression had come apart from its usual composure in the way it did sometimes, the way it had on Christmas Eve, the careful held-togetherness easing at the edges. "You're getting better at saying things," she said. "I'm working on it." "I know you are." She uncrossed her arms. "For the record," she said, using his phrase back at him, "I would do all of it again too." The ankle and the wolves and the cold and the beans. A pause. Even the salt pork. The salt pork wasn't that bad. It was, she said firmly. It was genuinely bad, but I ate it and I'd eat it again, and that is the point I'm making. He looked at her, at the straight spine and the dirt still faint under her fingernail from the garden that she'd missed washing, at the red still faint at the edges of her eyes from Daniel's sister's letter,